All right, so hello everyone. We're live. It's probably a long-awaited debate between Richard Yetter-Chappell and Michael Huemer about utilitarianism, settling for once and for all the question of whether utilitarianism is correct. It'll be fully settled after this conversation. No further discussion needed. So yeah, and so there will be 10-minute opening statements. And do either of you have a preference as to who goes first?
I know. I thought I would probably go first because Richard is probably going to respond to my examples. I assume.
Okay, sounds good.
So someone should say what the examples are first. All right. Let's see. Okay, so I have a little slideshow. So I'm going to try to. Let's see. How do I do this? 1 second. Okay, is this working? Can you guys see this?
Not yet.
No.
Okay, let me see what's happening. Okay, this one. What about that? Really? Okay, wait.
Oh, now it is.
Okay, all right. Anyway, so that's how you do that. Okay. Yeah, so I had a blog post called Why I'm Not a Utilitarian. So they made some slideshows. These slides are basically based on that post. So I'm just going to go through some, counterexamples that people like to give to utilitarianism. Well, let me see if I can even advance the slides now at this point. How about that? Okay. Anyway, this is utilitarianism. It's the view that you should always perform the action that maximizes the total amount of pleasure or desire satisfaction in the universe. All right, so, here are some counterexamples that people give, alleged counterexamples. First, there's the experience machine. So this is a hypothetical machine that can produce any desired experiences by direct brain stimulation. So you get attached to this machine, and then unfortunately, there's no way of detaching it. So once you're attached, you're there for the rest of your life. But it will stimulate your brain to produce, the maximum amount of pleasure possible for your brain to experience or something like that. And you could just have the pleasure center of your brain stimulated for the rest of your life. Of course, you have to give up on, having a normal life. Most people think that you should not do this. And indeed, that this is a bad life, not only not the best possible life, but utilitarianism implies that this is the best possible life that you could hope for, being plugged into the machine. Okay. There's another famous example, the organ harvesting example. There's a healthy patient in the hospital, and there are 5 sick patients who need organ transplants, without which they will die. Somehow the one healthy patient is compatible with the other 5. So what you could do is kill the healthy patient and then, take 5 of his organs and save 5 other lives, right? And assume the other patients all need 5 different organs. So you could save 5 lives. Looks like, this would create a greater net benefit, but most people think that this would be morally wrong. Okay, here's a third example, also famous, the framing the innocent person example. A crime has recently occurred in a town that has caused a lot of public outrage. And the sheriff of the town believes that there are going to be riots unless somebody is punished for this crime. And the riots will probably cause more harm than the amount of harm of being unjustly punished. Unfortunately, he can't find the real perpetrator, but what he can do is frame an innocent person, and that will cause the innocent person to be punished for this crime, but it will forestall the riots. All right. And, so the utilitarian reasoning is, so you're producing greater benefit or avoiding a greater harm. So it's the right thing to do. Most people think that that is the wrong thing to do. As another example, so, there's somebody, a friend of yours is dying, and, he makes you promise that you will make sure that his estate goes to his son or something like this. And, and you can do this by just telling the authorities that that was his dying wish. And then after he dies, Like, so you make the promise, but then after he dies, you think, I could just tell the authorities that his dying wish was to give all his money to charity. And, that would do more good than giving it to his kids. So you could do that. And then most people think you should not do that. Okay, here's another example. All these examples are about, particular other values that utilitarians don't believe in. Okay, so this one is about dessert and, how not just dessert in the sense of tasty things, but dessert in the sense of deserving something. All right, so you have a tasty cookie and you could give it to either serial murderer Ted Bundy or, Saint Mother Teresa. Assume, Ted Bundy is a terrible person and assume that Mother Teresa is a very good person, right? However, Ted Bundy likes cookies slightly more than Mother Teresa does. So, and, assume there will be no other effects of this action. So if you give it to Ted Bundy, there will be more pleasure in the universe, but, Mother Teresa is more deserving. Here's another example. This one has to do with, this might sound like it's sort of the same issue, but it's not. This one has to do with whether sadistic pleasure counts as valuable. So you could kill one Jew in order to give pleasure to a large number of Nazis. So if you kill the Jew, you can have this televised to many Nazis who will each get a little bit of pleasure out of it. And there are so many of these Nazis watching this that the total amount of pleasure will be greater than the amount of pleasure that one victim would have gotten in their life. Okay, and also assume that you don't have to tell any non-Nazis about how this happens. So there will only be the pleasure of the Nazis. And most people think you should not do this, but it does increase the total amount of pleasure in the universe. Here's another example. Imagine that, you have a cookie, let's say, and imagine that, oddly enough, you yourself are the person who would get the most pleasure out of this cookie. Nevertheless, you altruistically sacrifice your interest and give it to another person who will also enjoy the cookie, although slightly less than you. Okay, utilitarianism implies that this is immoral, and most people think that is not immoral. It is imprudent, perhaps unwise, but it's not immoral. Okay, here's another example that I made up. So there's a professor who, let's say, is smart and, is giving away a certain amount of money to charity every year, enough to save, let's say, 10 lives every year. But he could have, instead of being a professor, become a wealthy lawyer, in which case he could have given away more money. And let's say, he's saving 10 lives every year, but he could have instead saved 50 lives every year. So, he's short, he's like saving 40 less than he could have. Meanwhile, there's a serial killer who doesn't have any skills, so he couldn't be saving anyone's lives. But he is also murdering 30 people every year for fun. Okay, who is behaving worse? And it certainly seems like the serial killer is behaving worse, but according to utilitarians, it looks like the professor is behaving worse because killing is equivalent to letting die. Serial killer is killing 30 people, only 30. And the professor is failing to save 40 people. So the professor is acting worse. Okay, and anyway, so, here's the, sort of like overall thought that utilitarianism conflicts with a lot of very strong and very widely shared ethical intuitions. Now, you could have different attitudes about intuition. Some people think that intuitions count as evidence for whatever is their content, and other people don't. If you think that ethical intuitions count as evidence for ethical propositions or, a source of justification, then, you should reject utilitarianism because it just conflicts with so many, firm and widely shared intuitions. Like, on the other hand, if you think that intuitions don't count as a source of justification for ethical propositions, then you still shouldn't be a utilitarian, because then you should just be a moral skeptic. Because then you have no reason for believing there are any ethical truths at all. Like, you wouldn't have any reason for thinking that pleasure is better than pain, or that producing more good is better than producing less good, or, or that you should care about the good of other people and not just yourself, etc. So, I think either way, you shouldn't be a utilitarian. Okay, that's all. I can stop sharing my screen there.
All right, should I go ahead?
Yeah, go ahead.
All right, so thanks very much, Mike. So I'm going to start by sort of stepping back a little bit and kind of give an overview of the way I sort of thinking about the sort of moral questions here before getting into addressing some of the particular sort of putative counterexamples that Mike's bringing to our attention. Okay, so first of all, just getting clear on utilitarianism. So here I take the view to be basically the combination of consequentialism, because it's always better to bring about a better outcome rather than a worse one, together with impartial welfarism. So that's the idea that what's good is just the well-being of sentient beings considered impartially. So importantly, this does not include any assumption of hedonism. I'm definitely not a hedonist. I'm on board with thinking the experience machine would be not good for you to get plugged into. So I'm on board with that. And I should also say, I guess I'm actually not strictly committed to defending like the very strict letter of utilitarianism as such. So, but rather just that it's sort of approximately correct. So one thing where I actually think utilitarianism is just wrong is in its failure to take into account desert. So some of the examples Mike gave of Mother Teresa, I mean, questionable how good she really was, but supposing that she lives up to her reputation, some saint better than a serial killer, that it would be a better thing for benefits to go to a better person and not to go to an evil person. That seems right to me, and I think a better version of consequentialism would be slightly a sort of desert-adjusted form of utilitarianism rather than the sort of strict one that ignores desert. So I'm on board with that emendation. And there are other sort of minor changes that one could add to the view that wouldn't bother me too much. Like one could add in some non-welfarist values, like you could add in environmental values and other stuff like that, just as long as welfare is still sort of the predominant value. That's like the main, most important thing. Some small tweaks around the edges aren't going to bother me too much. I'm happy to sort of remain neutral on those. I think you could even add in some moderate partiality in favor of your nearest and dearest. You might have more reason, more moral reason even to like save your child rather than like two strangers' children, for example. But I think, again, those sort of slight tweaks aren't really going to make that much difference in practice. In a world where we can sort of do 100 times more good or more for the global poor, we can maybe do billions of times more good for distant, far future people than for other people today. I think slight tweaks to partiality aren't really going to make much practical difference to the implications of the view anyway. So those are things I'm sort of happy to remain slightly neutral on. But it's a view that is at least approximately utilitarian that I'm interested in defending. Now, regarding this sort of consequentialism aspect of it, this idea that it's always better to bring about a better rather than a worse outcome, I think the most important aspect of this view is its scope sensitivity, the idea that doing 1,000 times more good is 1,000 times more important. And given the opportunity to do a lot of good, it's really important to do so. So utilitarians tend to be really into effective altruism for this reason. But of course, a lot of people could endorse scope sensitivity without going all the way to full-blown consequentialism or utilitarianism, because you could combine that important scope sensitivity view with sort of moral constraints at a sort of theoretical fundamental level. So the aspect of consequentialism that I think gets the most academic attention and that's really playing a big role in a lot of Mike's counterexamples is this idea of the moral constraints being kind of merely instrumental. So when you think of a rule like do not kill, it's not that this is like baked into the fundamental like law of morality that the most important thing is that you just do not ever kill anyone. Rather, the important thing is to bring about better outcomes. Usually we shouldn't kill people because obviously killing people tends to be pretty bad, but you can at least imagine conceivable situations where somehow killing someone would actually lead to more good. And in that fantastical scenario, consequentialism has the implication that, yeah, killing the one to save more is actually the better thing to do and the sort of the thing you really ought to do. It's more worthwhile. And that's, I think, something that I think is, although not important in practice, because I just don't think there are realistic cases where you have good grounds for believing that you're in a situation where sort of violating people's rights is going to do more good than harm. But I think it's very important theoretically. And I'll sort of come to that as why I think that's something important to defend. Stepping into this next sort of section where I'm going to talk a little bit about methodology and how I'm seeing kind of the role of intuition here in response to Mike's dilemma. Okay. So as far as my sort of methodology for thinking about how to approach ethics and these disputes, I think that good philosophical ethics involves thinking systematically about what really matters, and then about what specific moral claims then make sense in light of these more fundamental commitments regarding what matters most. So I think our grasp of what really matters is obviously going to depend on our intuitions about what matters. So in some sense, I'm on board with Mike's intuitionism, but I want to draw a distinction between really fundamental intuitions about the normatively important things, what really matters, and more kind of superficial, more superficial intuitions. I feel are almost more like just kind of playing a language game or something. So I want to kind of contrast my approach with what I think of as a kind of a bad methodology, one I think is misguided. It treats ethics more like a language game where we sort of look at what meanings could be attached to various moral terms like wrong or whatever. And we try to attach the meanings that will superficially validate common intuitions about how to use those words. This is maybe, this might be a slightly unfair characterization of the opposing view, but it's sort of how it appears to me. So just to give an example of the contrast between these two approaches, you can just think about a standard counterexample kind of case where you can kill one person to save 5 and it seems wrong. So you could use Mike's organ harvesting case. When I was thinking about this, writing up my notes, I was thinking about this sort of a standard trolley case where you can push one person in front of the trolley and it'll make the trolley stop and it'll save 5 people who otherwise would have been run over. Now, in that kind of case, it seems wrong to push the one. I share the intuition. I'd be inclined to say, initially just thinking about it, yes, that seems wrong to push a person in front of a trolley. Certainly, in most cases, you shouldn't go around pushing people in front of trains and killing them. But if you reflect on it more deeply and ask, is it more important that the 5 people are saved or that you keep your hands clean by not pushing the one person in front of the trolley? I think then, just thinking about it more, my intuition really is no, it just is way more important that 5 people are saved than that one person is not killed. So I think there's a real difference between our tendency to initially think, yeah, it seems wrong, versus thinking about it more. And there's a question there. And thinking about it some more and getting to this deeper question of what really matters. Okay. So there's for those in the audience who sort of share my intuition about what matters, that it really is kind of more important that the 5 people are saved, but also initially had that, it seems wrong kind of thing. I think it raises this interesting question of what is signified then by our sort of claims of wrongness. Like what is really meant by saying that it's wrong if you actually think it's more important to save the 5, and so the thing that's really worth doing is indeed to push the one in front of the trolley. And I think there are a number of sort of different proposals that could be explored there. For some kind of more derivative notion of wrongness that isn't getting at the fundamentally important thing. I think one obvious candidate would be something along the lines of like, because the act is of a type that would usually expect to be harmful, you'd endorse a general rule prohibiting those kinds of acts. And so maybe sometimes people use the word wrong just to express that some kind of endorsement of a rule prohibiting that kind of action. But of course, utilitarians can very well endorse a general rule opposing that sort of thing. They just think, what you actually should do is sometimes to violate the rules that are worth endorsing. So just have the fact that you endorse the rule doesn't settle the question of what's actually the most worthwhile action to do. So as such, I think having this kind of intuition that the act is wrong in this derivative sense just isn't actually any counterexample to utilitarianism at a deeper level. Okay. So that's sort of my background way of thinking about these issues. If we then get to the more concrete question of, okay, so we want to get at the question of what really matters, how do we answer that? What is it that really matters? And it does seem, I think, that utilitarianism gives a pretty good answer to this, at least an approximation, that as a sort of first pass, the idea that people's well-being is what really matters seems very plausible. And of course, there's no basis for like speciesism. So the fact that we're human isn't the essential thing. So we can generalize and conclude, okay, well-being generally is what is really important. And bringing about a world that contains more well-being, where the sentient beings are sort of flourishing rather than suffering, that seems like, what really matters. That's at least sort of my intuition when I sort of reflect on these sort of deep axiological questions about what's important. If we ask further, like, do moral rights or constraints matter intrinsically? It really just seems to me that they're much more instrumental. It would seem strange, I think, to give like really fundamental significance to those sorts of things. So, I mean, there'd be no point in having rights that didn't serve to make people better off overall. So I think that's one thing that kind of indicates that they're really best seen as mere instruments, useful instruments, but not something that's foundational to ethics. And so if you have a case where an instrument gets in the way of the thing that it's actually instrumental for, the rational thing is obviously to pursue the ultimate end, not to stick to the useless instrument. Pursuing money, even when it makes you miserable, would not be a rationally prudent thing to do. And I view sort of rights as being just sort of an instrument in the same kind of way that money is. Similar things can be said, I think, about things like the doing-allowing distinction. There are good practical reasons why it's sort of often relevant and could be, worth sort of building some practical norms around, and we can talk about that more. But at a fundamental level, if you die, it doesn't matter whether your death was the result of action or inaction, killing or letting die. You're just as dead either way. It's not like getting pushed in front of the trolley is any worse for you than getting run over by default because some confused deontologist didn't realize that it was more important to save 5 people. And I mean, I think if anything, I'd probably prefer, if I was guaranteed to have to die in one of these 2 ways, I'd probably prefer for my death to actually be kind of meaningful and useful and serving some larger goal. So definitely don't want to give any foundational, really fundamental weight to doing-allowing here and thinking oh, it's just so important that people not be killed. It's really, so much better if we just let them die. That seems pretty misguided to me. So I guess all of that kind of way of thinking really leads me to think that when people say it's wrong to kill 1 to save 5, it just doesn't seem to me that they can really be thinking systematically about what matters when they're making those claims. They're making some other sort of claim. Maybe they're feeling an emotional aversion to pushing the 1, and that's certainly a good aversion to have. I endorse that aversion. But, I think in making the sort of, if they conclude from that it would be not worth pushing 1 to save 5, that it would be a mistake in action to do that, then I think they're not paying enough attention to the 5 others who are going to die if the agent does nothing. And it's understandable. Those 5 other victims are not as psychologically salient to us. They're not as obvious. They don't spring to mind as much as the 1 person who you're about to lay hands on. But nonetheless, in principle, they're obviously moral equals and ought to be taken into account just as much. And so I think maybe just to sort of wrap up my introductory comments, I think the thing that maybe I find most appalling about deontology is I see it as basically a theoretical embodiment of status quo bias. So, the trolley's already heading towards the 5, and so they just conclude sort of who cares about those 5, in effect. They sort of carry less weight because the default is that they're the ones in trouble. And whereas the 1 person, by contrast, is cushy and safe by default. So it's seen as really, really bad. If I were to go up and push the safe cushy 1 in front of the trolley, I'd really be upsetting their privileged position. And deontologists don't like that. But if you asked all 6 people from behind the veil of ignorance whether I should kill 1 of them to save the other 5, they would all agree that obviously I should, just from their self-interested perspective. A 5 out of 6 chance of survival is a hell of a lot better than 1 out of 6, after all. So for the 1 to suddenly object once the veil is lifted and they find themselves in the cushy position, they're oh, no, actually, I want to be the one who survives now. That's just selfish special pleading from them at that point. I think any moral theory that takes the side of the 1 over the 5 is similarly just kind of being unprincipled. They're favoring the 1 just because he was better off to begin with. But that's just completely morally arbitrary. In the situation we're imagining, none of the 5 deserved to be in the path of the trolley. It was just bad luck that they found themselves in the shitty position. So I think it's really important to sort of remember that the world isn't set up to guarantee justice by default. Sometimes the world is shitty, and then it's incumbent upon us to do better and to make it better. I think it's really the role of moral agents to improve upon shitty situations that we happen upon. And so if it would have been better to have just 1 person rather than 5 in the path of the trolley, and you can make that happen, then that's what you should do. You should make it happen. As the saying goes, be the change you want to see in the world. I think that's a nice kind of embodiment of the consequentialist ideal. When deontologists say that as a matter of principle, you mustn't violate someone's rights to make the world a better place, what they're really saying is that anyone in a privileged position matters more than all the people in shitty positions. And I think that's messed up. So I think once you take moral equality seriously and reject status quo bias, you end up with utilitarianism instead. So I think it's actually a much better theory. I haven't had a chance to go through Michael's sort of counterexamples 1 by 1, but you can kind of get a sense of how I'm going to approach them. I'm happy to chat more as the discussion continues about any of those particular examples. Thanks.
Just before the open discussion, you both seem to be in agreement about desert, and I'm not in agreement with both of you about such things. But so I wrote a response to Michael on the on his cookie example. And the title of the article was "Against Cookies for Dessert," which I was proud of that title.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I guess I'm in favor of cookies for dessert. Well, okay. I mean, I guess I want to say a bunch of things. Richard's questions, what is important and what matters. Like, I think both of those questions are just ambiguous between an axiological reading and a deontic reading. So there's, there's an axiological concept of mattering and importance, which is just like how good something is. And then there's a deontic reading, which is, what matters is what you have most reason to do, or what gives you the strongest reason for action. And so, the deontologist is just going to say, well, yeah, saving the 5 matters more in the axiological sense, but it matters less in the deontic sense. And then it's just not going to help us to talk about that, I think. What else was I going to say about this?
If I could just jump in very quickly on that point. I mean, I do think it's worth stressing that I think the intuitions of these counterexamples are going to be much less strong when phrased in terms of like reasons for action rather than the word wrongness. So, do you really have less reason to push the one person in front of the trolley to save 5? My guess would be that more people would reject the deontologist claim in that case. I think it's far less counterintuitive to say you really do have reason to save the 5.
Yeah, I mean, what if we phrase it as, do you have more reason to not push the 1 than you have to not save the 5? So, because, you might think you have a really strong reason to not push the guy in front of the trolley because it's morally wrong and because it's murder. And, and not saving the 5 isn't murder. So I don't have a stronger reason to avoid that. I don't know. I mean, you'd said like a bad methodology is sort of relying on linguistic intuitions or something like that. And I didn't see these examples as being that. So, I mean, there's linguistic intuitions about the use of the word wrong, but also there's just like the sense of wrongness, right? Which is that when you think about doing this action, it just seems like you really shouldn't do that. And I think you can have that intuition, without having the word, right? What else?
Yeah, I mean, it might be worth exploring that point a little bit before we move on. So, so I think I definitely agree with you that there is a normative intuition in this vicinity. It's not like a purely linguistic thing. I guess what I'm a little bit worried about is reading too much into exactly what normative intuition it is. So there's definitely something kind of disturbing or problematic about the situation and the act of someone who's like pushing someone in front of a trolley. But of course, a utilitarian can agree with that, right? There are lots of things that they can judge negatively about that agent in that situation. They've probably got dispositions which lead them to be like far too callous and far too ready to like kill people at the drop of a hat, which is not going to be a good disposition to have in most of life. In most situations. So if the intuition is just like there's something negative here, then we can capture that. And so the question is specifically like, is it the intuition of moral wrongness where it's like there really is most reason not to perform this action and it would be a deeply mistaken action, not just like reckless in some way or indicative of a problematic disposition or character, but it's the thing that's not worth doing in this situation. And I think when we really push on that and try to make it clearer, then I think there's a lot of room for the utilitarian to just comfortably say, I don't have that problematic intuition at all. I don't think the view's sort of counterintuitive in that respect.
I mean, I guess I just think most people would say yes. So, utilitarians might have, corrupted intuitions or something, or maybe utilitarians are just people who don't have the same intuitions that most people had, never had them in the first place. Or, one thing you might think is, there's just like this emotional mechanism, like you feel bad about pushing the guy and you don't feel as bad when you're not like touching the guy or you're not close to him or whatever. So like, here's an analogy, right? Like there's somebody who needs surgery and like, you have to cut into the person's body and whatever, and all this blood is coming out. And, you have this feeling, oh, that's gross. Oh, it seems, really don't want to do that. But nobody would say they have the intuition that it's wrong, right? And so, like, I want to say, like, what happens in cases like the organ harvesting or pushing the fat guy in front of the trolley, it's not just having an emotional aversion, right? It's that it really seems like you shouldn't do it. Don't have another way of phrasing that. But.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if there's really that big of a difference there, though. I mean, so what I'm thinking is, it seems like with something like the surgery case, we can kind of explain that because, I mean, it's not really strong reasons not to do the surgery. I mean, you could try to separate out like the reason not to cause the pain by like cutting into the person's body or something, supposing there wasn't anesthesia available or whatever. But still, you end up saving their life, so it's overall worth it. But certainly when you think about like the kinds of reasons you have here, it's the reason to like help this particular person. Taking that person's interests into account, it's just the reasons are overwhelmingly in favor of the surgery, and there's not anything counting against it significantly. Whereas in the interpersonal case, like these sort of trolley examples, for example, there it seems like there really are genuinely strong reasons to not push the person in front of the trolley, right? I mean, you're like completely like killing that person, and like that it's terrible for their interests. And so there are very strong reasons against it. And I think the utilitarian can agree that there are really strong reasons against pushing people in front of trolleys. And those reasons are super duper salient in the case where like you're the person placing your hands on the person and thinking about pushing them. Like those reasons against doing it have got to be super duper salient to you in that case. It so happens that there are even stronger reasons to save the 5 people down the line who you can't really see so well. Those reasons aren't as salient to you. They're not going to have as much of an emotional impact. So we can sort of explain it in terms of this emotional aversion. But it is partly a response to genuine reasons. It's just that you're not seeing all the reasons equally. You're not sort of giving the more distant ones a fair run.
Right. So you might think that your emotions lead you astray when there are reasons. They just sort of like amplify your perception of how big the reasons are. But if you just know that there aren't any good reasons, then they don't amplify that.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know. Maybe. I mean, you had mentioned like the possibility that, you've got to do the surgery, without anesthetic because you don't have any anesthetic or something. So then there would be strong reasons not to do it. But it would just be clear that they were outweighed, or it would be like they're outweighed on anybody's view. So, you might think, why doesn't my emotional mechanism amplify these reasons, and, cause me to mistakenly think that they outweigh the reasons for saving the life or whatever. Anyway, I wanted to, say something about the, maybe the status quo bias. I don't know. Maybe in some respects the status quo bias is justified. How would we know? Like, you're saying it like it's a bad thing, but sort of like, we have to use our ethical intuitions to judge whether it's a bad thing or not. And like, if you convince me that, like the killing, letting die distinction is status quo bias, then I would say, oh, okay, so I guess, sometimes status quo bias is good. Not always, right? Just only sometimes in certain ways, right? I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a matter for reflective equilibrium. So I agree with you sort of methodologically. That's just going to depend on whether, once I sort of bring this to people's attention, do they sort of share my sense that this is a problematic kind of status quo bias, and there doesn't seem to be a good principled reason, and you no longer support the idea of favoring the person who was privileged by default. That's the way certainly my intuitions go. But, if you just bite the bullet and say, no, I'm happy to support, the privileged in this case, I think it would be murder not to. And so that's why we should do it. I guess I can't,
Yeah, I mean,
if you're happy to endorse that.
Yeah. I mean, when you mentioned like, supporting the privileged as opposed to the people who are in a really bad situation, like that does seem like that might be appealing to a different, not exactly utilitarian intuition, right? Because there are these people who have, egalitarian or prioritarian intuitions. Like they think if somebody's initially worse off, then it's more important to help that person than to help someone who's better off, even if the better off person could get a greater benefit, right? And so, you can have a case where there's somebody who is overall worse off, but they wind up in the, privileged by deontology position, right? Like, you can help a person who's, you'd help the better off person buy more, and you would harm the worse off person or whatever. And you still can't do it. Like, you can't sacrifice better off people to help a larger number of worse off, but you also can't sacrifice the worse off people to help a larger number of better off people. So it's like, the deontological position isn't, exactly this sort of like favoring the privileged idea, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm not meaning to appeal to a blanket, like never favor the privileged kind of rule, even if it would actually be sort of justified by utilitarian lines. That's not the idea. It's more just that this seems like a particular case where both like efficiency is on one side and there's just privilege on the other. And it really seems like if you're going to favor the privilege, there's got to be some like better justification for it, like that you're actually giving way more benefit to them than to the other people, for example.
Yeah. You might say, well, your point was that you shouldn't like favor somebody because they're privileged, right? Because they're in a better situation.
Yeah.
But it's not that you have to disfavor them because they're privileged.
Yeah, exactly.
But then the deontologist is going to say, well, I'm not favoring them because they're privileged. I'm favoring them because, doing harm is worse than allowing harm or something. It's just, it's the type of action. It's not the type of person.
Yeah. It's difficult to sort of separate out the two concepts in that case to some extent, I think, just because in a sense, the very fact that it's doing rather than allowing harm is so closely intertwined with the fact that they are in a privileged position. Like they're in the position which is by default going to be better for them and worse for the others. So in a way, it's almost like I'd have to think more about it, but it sort of seems like on the face of it to me, this sort of the very notion of sort of a distinction between doing and allowing is almost like presupposing that a certain kind of privilege here is justified. That the status quo is not arbitrary or something along those lines.
Yeah, there's a way in which having these allowing distinction cases, like that the person who is up for you allowing harm is, prima facie in a worse position because the status quo is that a harm is happening or is about to happen to them, and the person who you have the chance to do harm to is in a better position because they don't have the harm yet. Yeah, right. So there's a way in which it's sort of like built into the distinction that you're favoring the people who are prima facie better off, right? But of course, there could be other circumstances that make them actually, overall worse off, and and that doesn't make a moral difference according to the deontologists. Sure. Anyway,
what do you make of the veil of ignorance argument in this context?
Good. I don't know. So I'll tell you something that I say about Rawls sometimes, right? Like, all right, so here's like a hypothetical story that I tell about the time I met John Rawls. This did not happen, but like I had this lottery ticket, and I just found out that I won. It's like $1 million ticket, and I'm walking down the street and I meet John Rawls. I'm like, hey, John. Hey, Mike, how you doing? And I go, I'm doing great. I just found out that I won the lottery. And Rawls goes, well, okay, here's $10. Give me that ticket. And I go, are you crazy? I'm not giving you the ticket for $10. It's a winning ticket. I'm going to get $1 million. And he goes, well, okay, you paid $3 for the ticket to begin with. If you didn't know that it was a winner, would you have sold it to me for $10? And I go, yeah, of course, because then I could buy 3 more tickets. Just as good. He's like, okay, so that proves that it's a completely reasonable and fair offer. So give me the ticket for $10. And then he takes out his gun and demands the ticket. Okay. And so I want to say, no, it would have been reasonable and fair if I didn't know that it was a winning ticket. But since I know, it's not reasonable or fair. And I think a similar thing about, so I don't know how well this answers your actual point. I just thought of this to answer Rawlsians and their points about wealth redistribution, right? So it's like, yeah, maybe if I was in the veil of ignorance, I would have agreed we should be redistributing wealth, but it doesn't mean that it makes sense for me to actually agree now that I know that I won the natural lottery.
Yeah, a hypothetical agreement's not worth the paper it's not written on, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think in the sort of case you're imagining, I think part of the force of it stems from the fact that there's kind of an asymmetry in enforcement, that we're imagining, rules would not have made the $10 offer had your ticket been the losing one. So you're being sort of asymmetrically disadvantaged by this partial enforcement of this hypothetical sort of thing. Whereas if we imagine a version of the case where there's actually like a sort of institution set up to like take away Mike's lottery ticket each week and give him $10 in exchange, seems like that's maybe like a fairer thing. I mean, I think that's sort of a reasonable model of social insurance in general, that I think, most people would actually agree to that beforehand, and it seems like a good deal for them. So it seems strange for them to object afterwards. It does seem to bring up the special pleading situation. If you're like, no, I actually finally won this time, let me keep this ticket. When you would have been very happy to have exchanged it on all the losing cases, which were most of them ex ante.
No, that's right. But I mean, like the thing with, I don't know if, this is off topic, but anyway, the thing with the wealth redistribution is, I think it's more like the first case, because like I'm the winner in general. It's not just like I'm a winner some weeks and not others. Like just in general, I won the natural lottery and I know that. And there was never a time that I didn't know that. So I'm smarter than other people or whatever, more hardworking than most people, and whatever it takes to succeed in life, or more prudent, maybe, whatever. So, it's like, it's always going to be taking the stuff away from me and giving it to somebody else. Like, there's never going to be a time, in your version where they take they give you $10 every week, sometimes your benefit, sometimes not.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's an interesting question how much that matters. And I guess that is relevant to our sort of the utilitarian version of the case too, because, once you've killed the one, they're not going to end up benefiting from this rule in future. So there's sort of a question of like, is there a relevant sort of, I mean, in this case, it does seem like ex ante, there is a time at which people don't know in advance whether they're going to end up on train tracks or on bridges overlooking the train tracks. And so if they do know that in general more people end up in the situation of the 5 than the 1, then maybe that's good enough to be able to say, no, it really is in the ex ante interest at this point in time to agree to the sort of utilitarian bargain. Maybe that is relevantly different from your objection.
That's right. I mean, so certainly, like if you got people to agree in advance, then I'm on board, right? Then you kill the one like he agreed.
But suppose they just never had a chance to coordinate. So, I mean, it would be one thing if they like all got together beforehand and were like, we don't know how we're going to end up distributed. Should we do this thing? And then one of them is like, no, I refuse. I explicitly do not consent to that. Maybe at that point, I could see you having like a stronger case to be made that no, it wouldn't be fair to then hold them to this thing that they've explicitly rejected. But suppose they just never had the chance to coordinate and they would have agreed to it beforehand, as would all the others. It seems like we're just sort of letting ourselves in for like missed opportunities for coordination and cooperation if we allow these things we all would have agreed to just sort of pass because the opportunity just didn't happen beforehand. We could do a lot better if we all agreed that we will endorse and enforce hypothetical agreements that we would all agree to in advance. Maybe we should all explicitly agree to endorse hypothetical agreements.
Yeah, well, good luck. So, you imagine saying you're there, ready to push the fat man, and he's like, no, don't push me. And you're like, if I had gotten you to agree in advance, if I'd asked you beforehand, would you have agreed? And he's like, I guess. And then you're push him on. And that's kind of like Rawls buying my lottery ticket for $10 and saying like, I have to sell it to him because I would have sold it to him if I didn't know what position I was in. I feel like, no, I don't have to do that. But like, I mean, all the stuff that I'm saying, I'm like just appealing to common sense, morality, intuitions, right? Like the importance of agreement or whatever. And, you might just not share those. So,
I mean, it is tricky. I mean, it's hard to know to what extent there's sort of intuitions corrupted by theory, as you say. Maybe utilitarians just have like different intuitions or messed up intuitions as a result of their theory, versus sort of my interpretation as being maybe more like, I can sort of initially see the intuition you're talking about, but it's one that I think on reflection, I'm inclined to reject it in favor of these much stronger intuitions I have about what's really important and seems principled and justified.
Yeah. So do we have like some questions from an audience or something?
Well, so one question that someone asked is, what do Richard and Michael think about the arguments that we should try to alleviate wild animal suffering? Seems relevant to the allowing harm is just as bad as harming discussion.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
So I guess I think causing harm is worse than allowing harm, but allowing harm is still bad. So if we could stop a lot of suffering for whatever creatures, whether they're our species or another species, if we could do that at low cost and without causing some other disaster, then we should totally do it. Of course, I don't see a really feasible way of doing this. There's a ton of suffering in nature. I don't see a feasible way of ending it, but if somebody comes up with a way, that would be great.
Yeah, and I guess the difference with my view is that I would tolerate higher costs maybe than Michael would for doing that if it was feasible.
Right, yeah. But by the way, I'm more sympathetic to utilitarianism for animals. So, if you push a fat animal off the bridge and save 5 thin animals or whatever, 5 other animals, I think maybe that's right.
What do you think about sadistic animal pleasure?
Wait, sorry, what?
What do you think about sadistic animal pleasure? Like if a lion gets pleasure from attacking the gazelle, does that count?
Is that good? I'm not sure about that. I'm trying to have an intuition about it, but it's unclear to me. So part of what's going on in the standard sadistic pleasure cases is that it's morally vicious, right? But then you think, well, the lion isn't really morally vicious because it doesn't have enough moral understanding, doesn't have enough capacity for understanding to be vicious. So maybe then the pleasure is good, but I'm not sure about this.
It's hard to even imagine the lion really having, the relevant sort of concepts to be able to have sadistic pleasure as such, rather than just taking pleasure as a result of its, having hunted this animal. And then it's presumably not taking pleasure in the pain per se of the other animal that it doesn't even have a conception of, but rather it's just, enjoying the thrill of the hunt or something, which seems, potentially perfectly innocent.
No, that's right. I mean, so in reality, probably no animal has sadistic pleasure because that's a social emotion. And you have maybe chimpanzees or something could do that, but you have to have an understanding of the other person's mind and then sort of valuing their suffering. And I guess I don't think lions have that.
One thing that might be interesting to discuss, given that it seemed to be sort of at a bit of would be the paradox of deontology that Richard wrote about. Because presumably Michael does not think that deontology is objectionably paradoxical. So,
sure. I mean, maybe a first step into this is just to ask about Michael's views about what bystanders should prefer when observing someone thinking about pushing the one off the bridge to save 5. So should a benevolent bystander want the agent to push the one off, kill one, and save 5, or should they prefer the?
I have thought about this paradox. So I think I thought about the same paradox. Yeah. I mean, on the face of it, it seems like just an uninvolved third party should hope that the one guy does the wrong thing in order to prevent something worse from happening, because you're not doing it. So, and it's not. And your hoping isn't morally wrong, right? That doesn't violate a constraint. It's just because it doesn't have any effect on the thing that happens. So, and then I mean, when I say this, so I talk about this in class. When I say this to the class, the next step is, well, does that mean that if you're on the bridge with a fat person, you should hope that you push the guy off the bridge?
Right.
Right. And we're still the ontologist is saying you shouldn't push him off the bridge, but you should hope that you do. Right. But then it's just very weird that you should hope that you do this thing, but not actually do it.
Right. Because it seems like you end up in the sort of terrain of saying that agents need to be instrumentally irrational, right? Because in general, you might think instrumental rationality involves sort of taking the effective means to the ends that you either have or ought to have, and this sort of moralized version of it. But if you ought to sort of have as your end that, and then sort of want that you push the one and save the 5, and then you don't do it. Seems like a paradigmatic kind of irrationality, and it doesn't seem like morality should require us to be irrational.
Yeah, I mean, I do kind of feel like that's maybe begging the question, sort of like assuming a notion of rationality that's like, maximize the achievement of some set of goals, right? And then
well, it leaves open the order of explanation for how your goals are settled. So it could well be that the agent's primary goal should be that they act morally, and so they should prefer that they not push the one, because they should so strongly prefer not to act wrongly. So, I mean, that's actually the way I think a deontologist should go. I think the deontologist ought to say that sort of the best version of the view will be one in which they don't prefer that you push the one. But that also seems kind of intuitively wrong. As you said, it sure seems like a bystander especially surely should want more people to be saved.
Yeah, so if you're the bystander and you're like, no, I hope he doesn't do it because it's so bad for somebody to commit a wrong. But, well, so you can just modify the example, right? So that it's the one person is deciding whether to commit a murder to prevent 5 murders.
Right.
And you can have the case such that deontologists think it's still wrong, right? And so really doesn't make sense for you to say like it's so bad for a person to commit a wrong action that you don't want one wrong action to occur rather than 5, So, and then the other thing is like, okay, so they might go, yeah, so I prefer only one wrong action occur. But if I'm in the situation, then I have this really strong preference that I don't commit a wrong. You could say that, like, I just care about me committing wrongs.
Sounds like a pretty self-centered view then, though, right?
Sorry, what?
Sounds like a pretty self-centered view then, if it's all about just yourself having clean hands. That doesn't seem like a very appealing conception of morality.
Right. It's weird, but also like, here, there's this example from, I think I got this from Judith Thompson, like, so variation on the organ harvesting example. Suppose that actually the reason why the 5 organ transplant patients are sick is that you, the doctor, infected them in an attempt to kill them. And so if they die, you will have murdered them. But after doing this, you realize that murder is wrong. And so now you want to save them. So now you're thinking about killing one healthy patient to save the 5. Okay. And so now, if you think it's super important that I personally not murder anyone, then you got to kill the 1 to save the 5, because otherwise you will have murdered the 5. But again, the deontological intuition is you can't do that.
Right.
So anyway, and this is all like, sort of making your point that there isn't really, there isn't really a way of parsing the deontological view as a view about like what is the most valuable, or, where like there's something that's really important and we're just trying to maximize whatever's important. Well, unless you say, no, what's important is me not committing murders now at this time. But that's a super weird view. Like if a previous action of mine constitutes murder, not so bad. just the one that I'm doing right now, that's really important. Like that's just weird.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I think it's a real problem for the view if it turns out to be impossible to combine with like a coherent preference ordering. Sure seems like it ought to be possible to have coherent preferences over states of affairs and morally loaded situations. I'm not begging any questions in favor of consequentialism here, because again, I'm totally open to the possibility that maybe they could have a coherent preference ordering that, takes facts about the right and wrong actions and deontic constraints as determining their preferences rather than the preferences determining what they ought to do. So that order of explanation is where the consequentialism versus deontology distinction can sort of come in, and both can be represented. But if it turns out that there just is no way to have a coherent deontology, which includes preferences over these situations, then that just seems like there's not a coherent view here.
I mean, there is a coherent way of describing the preference ordering, but it's time relative and agent relative, right?
Right. So not an acceptable coherent, not one anyone sensible would be willing to endorse, I take it.
I mean, in a sense, that is the deontologist's preference ordering, right? Prefers him not committing a wrong now. It's just that it's not plausible that that's an account of agent neutral good.
Well, I even don't think it's a plausible account of like what even the reasons really are. I mean, actually, one reason for this. Karen Satir has a paper I recommend. It's called Must Consequentialists Kill, which is a strangely titled thing because what he's calling consequentialism here is actually a kind of constraints view. It's just an agent neutral one. But he's precisely arguing for the view that the bystander should share the preference of the agent themselves and not violating the one's rights. And that's even in a case where it's like not killing one to prevent 5 other killings. He thinks that you can make sense of a bystander preferring that the one not be killed as a means, even though it would prevent 5 other killings. And it's an interesting paper and an interesting view. So I actually think that might be the best way for the deontologists to go, that you can sort of, you can have preferences that are agent neutral in this way. Because the general motivation for it, I mean, it sounds a little weird when you just put it like that, but let me see if I can find the quote where I think it comes out really nicely why we should think that. Let's see. Here we go. Satir writes, in general, when you should not cause harm to one in a way that will benefit others, you should not want others to do so either. Right. And that just seems like a true principle, actually, I think. There seems something really weird about, imagining a deontologist bystander looking at the person and wondering whether to push a person off the bridge, and this deontologist being like quietly sort of willing to themselves, push, push, push. Like that doesn't seem like a deontologist at all. It seems like they really shouldn't want the one to push the one to kill one and to save 5. And I mean, it can be a little puzzling to try to work out, well, hang on, what's the motivation? What's the basis for their preference? Because there'd be 5 killings otherwise, and a different version of the case we're imagining. So certainly they can't just be adding up the badness of each killing. It's not that kind of agent neutral view. It's rather one in which there's more like a kind of a holistic, almost like organic unity kind of thing, where one killing to prevent 5 is in some sense morally worse than 5 gratuitous killings just by themselves.
Right. Well, I mean, imagine that there are 5 people who each have a choice to kill one person, and save 5.
Yeah.
And they're all going to do it, but you can kill one person to prevent those 5 people from doing it.
Yeah. Again, at each instance, he's just going to say, think about what preferences you ought to have about that particular action. And he'll say, it's a deontologist sort of common sense view. You should prefer that the one not be killed as a means. And so, I mean, it'll be true of sort of each individual action. You should prefer that the agent not perform that wrongful action.
Yeah.
But that will not necessarily translate into wanting someone else to perform a wrongful action that would prevent more people from performing wrongful actions. So it's got a slightly complex structure to it, but it is a coherent view. And I think actually maybe the best way for deontologists to go. I have my own objection to some of the implications that end up following from that view, but I think it's an interesting view.
Yeah. I mean, I think the intuitive deontological view is just a different view of rationality, right? Is that rationality is not about maximizing utility on any account. It's not maximizing preferences, satisfaction or preferences. So, you could say, like, in some sense, I have the preference of the 1 die rather than the 5. Like I think that would be better, whatever. Like, if I'm not involved in the situation, I would wish that would happen. But, that just doesn't mean that I have to bring that about.
Yeah. I mean, I agree that it's not like it would be weird to say that rationality was about the maximization of preferences for the deontologist, because that makes it sound like the preferences come first and then the reasons for action are kind of a downstream result of those. And that's obviously the consequentialist picture, not the deontological one. But it does seem to me that you shouldn't have a conflict between what you ought to do and what you ought to prefer that you do. That way of putting it seems, I think, a bit more neutral, and something that even the deontologist should be on board with, that they shouldn't end up with preferences contrary to what they really ought to do.
Yeah. No, I mean, I kind of think like preference here is ambiguous now. It's sort of like, right, because there's like, what you think would be agent neutrally better, and sort of like there's what you intend to do or what you have reason to do or something you have reason to bring about, and maybe those come apart. So
so I don't think it's either of those concepts. So I think we can separate out maybe 3 things. So there's just what's like agent neutrally best, like what how the utilitarian evaluates things. Obviously that's not the relevant notion here. There's what you ought to do. That's just the action focused thing. But then I think there's this third real question about sort of the reasons for desire, basically, or fitting preferences, what you really ought to prefer. I think that's just sort of the fact of the matter as to what are the really genuinely warranted preferences to have here.
Yeah. What should you want to happen? Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure about that. Yeah, so, could these be different, what I should want myself to do and what I should do? Not sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think substantively, I think they shouldn't come apart. I think it would be a problem for a view if they did, but I do think they're conceptually distinct. I could make sense of someone who thought they come apart, and I just think they were substantively mistaken.
Yeah. I mean, I guess I think you could have reasons for having a pro attitude towards something, but like most reason to have a certain pro attitude to this action, but most reason to actually do a different action. But it might depend on what the pro attitude is. So
yeah.
Right. So and this, like, I agree that this is weird, right? But like, if you ask like what I should hope happens, like I should hope that the person pushes the guy off the bridge. But then like what I should actually try to bring about, I think I should not try to bring that about.
It does seem to lead to these really awkward kind of conflict within the agent's mental life. I mean, because when you think about the connections between preferences and other kinds of emotional reactions, what we should hope for, what we should regret afterwards, those sorts of things. It seems weird to like be constantly regretting people doing the right thing. That doesn't seem like an appealing view of morality, that it's this really regrettable thing. It's like, damn it, too many good people around doing the right thing, bastards.
Well, I guess I think you wouldn't have reason to regret, because I think regret is too tied to judgments about what was morally right or wrong.
Okay.
But anyway, I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe we should take more questions from the audience.
One sort of related follow-up question would be, so if this is true, it seems like the main point of disagreement between the two of you is about the doing versus allowing distinction. You both seem to have similar accounts of what makes people well off. And so if you hold that you should sometimes hope for people to act wrongly in ways that bring about good outcomes, Michael, then wouldn't you want to hope that Richard convinces more people, because you would hope that people would act wrongly in the way that he advocates?
Right. Yeah, maybe. Right. So maybe I should shut up, I should just let him win. I should go, oh yeah, you're right. But I should just hope that I do that, but maybe I shouldn't do that. because like I have a duty as a philosopher to try to defend the truth as I see it or whatever. But I should just hope that I can't successfully persuade you. Maybe that's right.
Yeah, God's sitting in heaven chanting like, "No, don't do it." He's like hoping that you don't do it, but like to be morally good, you should argue for the truth.
I mean, as a matter of fact, like I don't go around, trying to convert people away from utilitarianism regularly. Although I did have the blog post about that, but I'm not really bothered by there being utilitarians, because I mean, among other things, I don't think that any of them actually do the horrible things. I have a committed utilitarian colleague, Alistair Norcross, and like, when you tell him these counterexamples, he just like immediately bites the bullet. Whatever, it's like, yes, of course, of course, you should kill the healthy patient. That's obvious. Okay, but I don't believe that he would ever, in fact, do something like that. But I do think that it makes some difference. Like, I think being a utilitarian in actual practice, it causes people to like donate more money to charity. So it causes people to do the things that I think are good, even if I don't think they're obligatory. Right. So, I'm not actually upset about there being utilitarians.
So now that we've covered Richard's paradox of deontology, it also turned to Michael's paradox of deontology. The he wrote a paper called, like, I think, A Paradox of Weak Deontology. And I thought it provided pretty good arguments against deontology. So being a deontologist, or a threshold deontologist, I'd be curious to how you would respond to your own.
Yeah, how would I respond to me? it's really hard. In fact, if I had a clear response, I would have given it in paper. So the audience probably doesn't know what we're talking about. I mean, the short version is, okay, so deontologists think that there are some conditions in which you could cause a benefit to one person, and then you could cause a small harm to one person, then a larger benefit to another person, where the benefit would outweigh the harm, and that could be morally wrong. Okay, and then it seems like you could construct cases where there are two actions which are each morally wrong in that way, but the net effect is just a benefit for everyone. Right? So, the first action harms person A but benefits person B, and then the second action harms B but benefits A by a larger amount. And if you combine the two, then both of them are just benefited by a larger amount. And it seems like you could design the cases so that the respect in which the person benefits is the same as the respect in which they get harmed. So it's just just completely a benefit, right? Take $1 away from one person, but produce $2 of benefit for the other, and then and then with reverse, and then they're just $1 better off both. And then the paradox is that it looks like you could have two actions that are each wrong, but the combined action is right. Because I assume it's not wrong to just produce a benefit for two people. I'm not sure what to say about that. It's a paradox for the deontological view. I mean, the deontologist might want to sort of modify the deontological rules so that it becomes impossible to construct those cases. We might want to have it be that it's wrong to harm one person to benefit two, but it's only wrong if you don't have the opportunity to do the reverse action that benefits the first and harms the other. Right? Maybe the constraint has a exception clause for this case. So,
all right. One question that Christopher Minge asks is, what does Huemer think of the paralysis argument? By going about one's life, they cause many people to have their rights violated, but also prevent that many people in expectation. So just to be clear, the argument is every time you drive on the freeway, you have a sufficiently significant effect on driving patterns to reduce to change the distribution of hundreds of thousands of future people who will be born. Because if people have sex 1 second later, then it means that a different person will be born. And so as a result of that, you're just creating ripple effects that will have impact relating to the rights violation of vast numbers of people. And so this was originally presented in a paper which argued that sort of every time you drive to do something for kind of a trivial benefit, it's kind of analogous to pressing a button which has a 50% chance of saving someone's life, a 50% chance of killing someone, and certainty of giving you $5. So it seems like most deontological accounts would rule that out.
Can't do it. Yeah.
And yet that seems to be what happens every time we.
Oh, okay. I mean, I think it is okay to drive or just do random things. I was a little distracted by the driving example because I thought it was going to turn out to be about the risk of traffic accidents, but it's just about having any influence on anything. So I want to say, no, normal actions are okay. And the reason is going to be there's a couple of things, right? One is, well, the people who aren't here yet, so you're going to affect what people will exist in the future, but the people who aren't here yet, they don't have their rights violated if you cause them to not be born. So that they don't have rights yet until they exist or until they're on Earth. And the other thing is I think you don't. So you're going to do something which will be such that if you hadn't done it, certain rights violations would not have occurred. But that doesn't mean that you committed the rights violations. Right. So it's if you have a kid and then, the kid later commits a rights violation. I don't think it's the case that you committed the rights violation, right? Even though you caused it. And by the way, even though you can predict that sometimes your kid is going to do something morally wrong if you have a kid, but it's still not going to be true that you did it. So the constraint doesn't apply to it.
Well, so like, let's imagine that you had a kid. This was a very strange kid. You knew that the kid would produce a slight benefit to someone, and then would have a 50% chance of killing someone and a 50% chance of saving someone's life. In that case, would it be wrong to have the kid?
I don't know. Is that wrong? Wow. So wait. So the kid is going to not know at the time whether he's saving or killing someone, or he does know, and I just don't know which he's going to be doing.
The kid knows, you just don't know.
Oh, okay. So yeah, he's either going to be a life-saving person or an evil murderer. Is it wrong to have that kid? Maybe, I guess. Yeah.
But so given that that's a sort of indirect action, indirect effect of your action, that seems to be kind of analogous to the paralysis argument.
Yeah, I mean, the downstream effects of just a random action are they're a lot less certain and, more indirect, I would say. There's sort of like the connection between you and the bad things that are going to happen is just like a lot more tenuous in most cases, which sort of like, diminishes your responsibility. The deontological thing is like, it really matters who's responsible for a bad thing happening. And, like if you're responsible for it, that gives you a really strong reason for avoiding whatever it was that made you responsible for it.
Do you think that's something that there really is like a fact of the matter as to how to determine responsibility in these ways? And I'm just thinking, like, I think my recollection of the paper that this is from, I think they maybe talked about things like arms dealers as a way of like trying to bridge this indirectness gap of being like, oh, you might still think an arms dealer was to blame for the foreseeable harms of like the people who end up committing war crimes given the chemical weapons that they gave them, or something like that. But, the arms dealer isn't the one doing the harm. So can they just sort of make this kind of excuse? Well, it wasn't me who was responsible. I just provided some means, and who knows what they'll end up doing with it. It's a sort of, can't murder at the door kind of response, right? But it's just not really clear to what extent there really is a real thing here. Sort of responsibility that you can really like delineate exactly how responsible you are for foreseeable versus unforeseeable.
Yeah, I mean,
seems kind of messy.
It's messy. I mean, so, like it's complicated and you can have borderline cases. So like there are cases of intermediate degrees of responsibility. Like you're most responsible when you're just like killing a person with your own hands. And then, you tell somebody to kill someone, it's still responsible. So, okay. But then, you just provided a means that somebody could use to kill someone, less responsible. So, I mean, like, your question was, is there a fact about how responsible somebody is? Well, there are things that make you more and less responsible. And I think that's a matter of fact. About like the arms dealer, well, it matters what he knew. So like, did he know that the arms were going to be used to, for some wrongful purpose? So then I think that's a pretty high degree of responsibility. But if he didn't, or, if he thought they were just going to be used offensively or something like that, then lower responsibility.
Suppose he thought, he didn't have certainty, but he thought likelihood, it's probably most likely they'll be used for some kind of atrocity. I don't know what atrocity, don't know any details, but it's predictable that they'll have some rights violation in the future as a result of this. Seems like you're in the exact same position with the distant future people. There are definitely going to be some rights violations as a result of your walking around in the world. You don't know exactly what they are, but you can foresee they'll happen.
No, yeah, but whatever happens, like you're going to have a lot less, you're going to have a, much more tenuous connection that goes through many, like you didn't exactly provide the means for these people. And like at the time that the wrong happens, it's going to be really hard to trace it back to you, right? But when the atrocity happens with the chemical weapons, I mean, it's your chemical weapons. I don't know. Like seems like
it's not just that, it's not just like the degree of credence that's relevant here. It's something like the number of like the length of the causal chain.
I mean, there's a connection to a pretty specific thing, right? and you're like, hey, if I walk down the street, that is going to have some influence on which atrocities occur sometime in the future. I guess, at some future time, there's going to be a murder that wouldn't have happened if I hadn't walked down the street today. Okay, I don't know. Also, I'm kind of like, yeah, but if I stay here, maybe there will be a murder that wouldn't have happened, if I hadn't stayed here. So.
But that's just an allowing. It's not your doing.
Oh, yeah, because sitting here is
just the same as if you just weren't
in action.
No causal space at all.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know, but it seems like I don't have to just hold my breath until I die. Like if that, that can't be the right view. So I don't know, right? Because that's the only thing that's not an action, right? The only non-action. Don't do anything, not even breathe. Yeah, I mean, it seems like something about the just indefiniteness. Like you have no knowledge about what these things are that are going to happen, right? And it's just like. Also, I guess I think the fact that the thing that's being said doesn't differentiate your action from any other action. It's like something that could be said about everything that everyone does all the time. Like it just seems like that can't make it wrong. It's got to be like you're doing something that has an especially strong connection with a certain type of wrong.
Yeah. I know. I think it'd be interesting to see a deontologist actually spell out a precise response to this argument that actually makes clear how they can avoid the upshot, because it seems difficult to avoid the conclusion for them.
One other thing that might be interesting to discuss, Michael, you're pretty sympathetic to rule utilitarianism, actually, and Richard, you're not at all. You disagree about whether it is so crazy to the blog post. So
that's right. I said it wasn't so crazy. So that's my endorsement.
Yeah, so I disagree with Michael about that. I think probably rule utilitarianism is just completely crazy. I think maybe the easiest way to see this is just to imagine a case where rule utilitarianism is the view that you should perform the action that's recommended by the best rules to internalize, perhaps. I mean, it's different ways to specify whether it would be the best rules for you in particular or the best rules for everyone in society. They'll lead to different problems. But let's suppose that it's just the best rules for everyone and the majority of people in society to internalize, something like that. You should perform the action that would be recommended by those rules in your circumstance. And then just imagine some really weird really weird situation, a possible world where an evil demon is messing around with stuff, such that the best rules to internalize are going to be these deeply misguided things. Right? So the evil demon says, you have to believe that you ought to torture puppies whenever you get the opportunity. If you don't believe that and you don't internalize that, I'm going to torture all of you forever. But I don't care whether you actually do torture puppies or not. I just want you to all believe this ridiculous thing. So once the evil demon tells us that, obviously the best rule to internalize says you ought to torture puppies. Ought you to torture puppies when the opportunity arises? No, of course not. That's ridiculous. There's no good, nothing is achieved by torturing the puppy in this situation. It's just gratuitous torture. So any view that says that gratuitous torture can be permissible, let alone obligatory, is clearly crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, my reaction to things like this is like my reaction to deviant causal chains. Obviously we meant the rule to have good consequences in a different way, not by one of these bizarre chains. And I don't know exactly how to specify what's the right way, but so the normal way in which internalizing rules causes good consequences, you want it to be like that, not via evil demons.
Yeah, just through the value of the actions you end up performing as a result of internalizing the rule, something like that.
I mean, it's something about this, but you're allowed to take into account, I think, you're allowed to take into account things like, having this rule has negative psychological consequences on normal people, right? And you're allowed to take into account whether people would actually follow it, I think, right? So the rule that Well, like, why isn't the best rule act utilitarianism, right? You know, like, do what the act utilitarian would do in all circumstances. That's a rule. Why isn't that right? And like, I think part of the answer to that is people believing that that's the correct thing to do does not, in fact, result in them doing that. Right. And also, like, part of the answer is like people are not very good at figuring out what does produce the best consequences. And like, so if they internalize the act utilitarian rule, when they're trying to follow it, they're going to mess up. And then a lot of the times they're going to not try to follow it. They're just going to like say, well, I'm immoral or whatever. So like, that might be why that doesn't have the best consequences. And I think those sorts of consequences of the rule are okay. But the thing where there's an evil demon just seems to me like not okay. Like,
yeah. So there's at least a challenge for the defender of the view to formulate it in a way that's not going to have this crazy consequence. Even once they do, and I mean, I agree with you, it seems like it should be possible to like get the relevant idea pinned down somehow. That'd be interesting to see exactly how. But I think there are still deeper problems with the view. Not that it's necessarily crazy in that way anymore, but just it seems to be kind of unmotivated. So I mean, the kind of most obvious motivation for rule utilitarianism would be something like the thought that, well, trying to be an act utilitarian would be counterproductive. But act utilitarians could agree with that and say, yeah, you should have a different decision procedure maybe. But it doesn't change the truth about like what actions are really, as the criterion of rightness, the thing that's like really most worth doing, the thing that like you really have most reason to do. If you're not very good at picking up on the moral reasons and have just like misguided empirical beliefs often, then maybe you shouldn't like be trying to like just do what the reasons say you really should do. You should be follow these rules of thumb that will be a bit more reliable and avoid atrocities and so forth. But still, what you really should do is what the reasons say, and trying to give an account of like the idea of rule utilitarian principles as providing the actual reasons for action seems kind of messed up, I think, when you try to sort of spell out what are the implications here. Think through some of the discussions we were having before about what you should want people to do in trolley situations. Again, if you sort of stipulate you're in a situation where you really know it would save more lives to kill the one, on what basis could the rule utilitarian possibly really prefer the person to stick by the rule that in this instance we know is an exception to the generally reliable rule? In this case, it's a bad rule to follow. Why would you still want someone to follow the good rule? Why should you yourself follow the good rule if you actually had reliable evidence that this was the one case where it's unreliable? It just seems like there's no principled basis for this view.
So I would like to take a bathroom break. Can we do that?
Yeah, sure.
And you guys talk amongst yourselves.
All right.
Did you have any thoughts, Matthew, from the discussion so far? Sort of things where you disagree with both of us, perhaps?
Well, I mean, I obviously disagree with both of you in where you reject hedonism.
Sure.
One question that I might ask, depending on whether we get to it, is so in the case about the Nazis about like sadistic pleasures. Would sadistic pleasures be actively a bad thing or just not be a good thing?
Yeah, I think that's a tricky question. It might depend a little bit on precisely how we pin down the nature of the pleasure. So if we're thinking of it as, I think in this sort of paradigm version, we're often meant to be imagining just like these bad people who have these like they have a desire for this pleasure because they want the other people to suffer. And so it's like because of this like evil desire they have that they then get pleasure from seeing their evil desire satisfied. That maybe I'd be maybe tempted to think that that's just not a good thing. And I mean, one explanation for that I think is a natural one is this sort of intuition about, we don't really want bad people to benefit at all, especially not to benefit at the cost of like innocent people. So if we have that kind of desert adjusted view of welfarism, then that could explain that. But there are different versions of the views, different ways we can imagine the case where the sadistic pleasure isn't actually based on anything morally terrible. So you can just imagine the society of people who like have some weird chemical imbalance in their brain, so that although they're like a society of utilitarians who just really want other people to have high flourishing, they do just have the physiological reaction of like feeling pleasure themselves when they see other people make like pained expressions and so forth. And so you could imagine in a case like this, although the utilitarians all want everyone in general to be happy, they realize the best way to achieve this is to have some people suffering. Suppose they're not very good at acting, so the only way to like get the pained expressions that'll make other people feel pleasure is for them to actually be in pain. And then you might imagine these sadistic utilitarians holding some kind of like lottery or something. They might themselves be willing to like volunteer, okay, torture me so that everyone else feels happier. And if they're all willing to do that, then maybe they hold a lottery and then one of them gets picked and they're tortured and everyone else is happier. It seems like there's maybe not anything bad about that. Maybe it is good that they have some extra pleasure. There's not anything like morally bad about the underlying causes of it or anything. It's just this weird neurological thing going on that causes them to feel happy when they have this sensory input. And if you imagine having the choice, like suppose you could cut off the broadcast so that no one would see the pained volunteer anymore, the pained person who was picked with the short straw of the lottery, would it be worth like cutting the broadcast so there was no longer any sadistic pleasure experience? Seems like no, that would be bad to cut the broadcast. The person would still be suffering just as much, but there'd be none of the sort of the gain that was the whole purpose of it, and that the person themselves was willing to suffer for others to have that gain. So a case like that makes me think that you could at least imagine situations where something that we might describe as sadistic pleasure, but is a bit different from the morally bad sort that we usually imagine, could be a sort of a reinterpreted as actually kind of an innocent pleasure in some sense that has the ordinary moral weight.
Yeah, I don't want to get too sidetracked talking about this, but just a brief note would be, to the extent that we think that sadistic pleasure is not merely a thing that isn't good, but it is a thing that's actively bad, then it seems like we get sort of the flip side of the wait, someone's echoing a little bit. I'm not sure who it is, but it seems like we get the flip side of the issue that Michael raised, which is that if you had, like, let's imagine that there were enough aliens that reveled in some horrific atrocity like the Holocaust that derived purely sadistic pleasure from it. Then we would have to say that if there were enough of them, that the primary badness of the Holocaust stemmed from making those lots of aliens happy rather than the suffering of the victim. And yet, like, that doesn't seem particularly intuitive. And I think that there are issues with the account which just says that it's not good, but it's not that it's neither good nor bad, that it's just neutral. But I don't want to sort of derail too much.
Yeah, okay. I'm not sure about that. I mean, I was thinking of saying more about Rule Utilitarianism, before I left. I mean, so, the motivation behind Rule Utilitarianism, like the first motivation is, it's going to do a better job of corresponding to our ethical intuitions. And so, like some of these things, you go like, oh yeah, you don't kill the healthy patient because the best rule for society involves no killing healthy patients. I have a pretty intuition-oriented methodology where I think, and this is a general epistemological point, like where people are better at judging particular cases than they are at coming up with sweeping generalizations that are true. Anyway, the other motivation sort of theoretically is you might think, the right thing to do is the thing that is recommended by the correct moral code, something like that. And what's the correct moral code? Well, it's the one that would have the best consequences. And so, there's some plausibility to that. You might think that that's just sort of like appealing to, linguistic intuitions or something.
Yeah, I don't think that latter argument really has any weight at all. But the one about the sort of matching our intuitions, I think it'd be good to explore this a little more, because it kind of comes back to your original objections to act utilitarianism as well. So I think it's kind of interesting to explore sort of how we're really interpreting these intuitions. So, I was kind of suggesting that actually act utilitarians can accommodate our intuitions in all these cases, just by saying you've kind of misdescribed them in some sense. There's a closely related intuition that at least the act utilitarian can endorse. So something like, it would be insanely reckless for a doctor to like carve up a healthy patient to save 5 other patients. You would expect that to have terrible consequences in like any realistic situation. You can't actually stipulate that the agent really has good evidence that this is not a thing like that. I mean, you can try to stipulate that, but I don't really see how to imagine a situation where the doctor really has genuinely good evidence that this is an exception case. So in the case that I naturally imagine, I really do judge that the doctor is being super reckless. We can stipulate that it's just by, fortunate kind of fluke, it really does do more good than harm. No one finds out about it. The risks didn't eventuate. So it's in some sense the objectively right action. God looking down on the world can be like, yeah, I'm glad he did it. He saved 5 lives instead of just 1. That's better. But still, we can evaluate the agent negatively and be like, they were super reckless. I wouldn't want him to be keeping on practicing his career the way he's doing it now. That's going to lead to terrible results in future. So what does the rule utilitarian judgment add to this?
I don't understand how this is super reckless. You're saving 5 lives. I mean,
just in terms of like the obvious consequences, if it came out that doctors were like routinely murdering their patients, who would go to a hospital anymore for routine checkups? There's so much more at stake than just 5 lives here. We're talking about population-wide implications.
But you're going to be the only one who does this, right? You're doing this doesn't make it so that doctors are routinely doing this, right?
So, I mean, I guess there's a question of how scared people would be.
Yeah. But let me now tell you something. There are actual cases in which doctors have killed patients in reality. In fact, there are even some cases of murders. Like most of them, the vast majority of them are accidental or, incompetence or sometimes malpractice.
Sure.
But there are actually cases where doctors murder their patients. People are still going to the doctor. Are you going to stop going to the doctor now?
No, I mean, I guess that's fair. I mean, I guess there's partly a question of, like, my suspicion is that it's going to be a much more kind of salient, scandalous kind of thing if it's not just like some like random, like mentally disturbed doctor killing their patients because they're a serial killer or something. But if it's actually like viewed as like this morally motivated thing that suddenly like mentally healthy doctors might start killing you because they've realized all these philosophy professors telling them that it's actually the right thing to do.
Maybe if after the thing happened, a bunch of philosophy professors started saying that was the right thing to do, then people would get worried. Anyway, I don't know. So, here's like a response. Maybe this is what you're saying. Like, most people's intuitions are really utilitarian. It's just that, when they hear the example, they assume that it's going to have worse consequences overall. And they're utilitarians at heart. And so that's why they judge that it's wrong to do that. And like that kind of sounded like the defense.
I mean, I'm not assuming that people are sort of utilitarians having utilitarian intuitions and explicitly assuming, sort of interpreting the case in a utilitarian friendly way. Rather, the thought is more that insofar as what you're trying to do is accommodate a certain kind of intuition that we have, namely a kind of reaction, like bad negative reaction to these kinds of cases, the suggestion is just that utilitarians can accommodate that intuition. So if your whole objection to the view is that it can't accommodate these intuitions, that's just that objection just doesn't go through, because we can at least accommodate some very closely related intuitions, like that it's a bad disposition to have, that it's violating a rule that we think would be a good rule to endorse, all those sorts of things. So we don't use the word wrong to apply to it, because we use wrong to point to actual reasons for action. But, if you wanted to redefine wrong, wrong subscript rules, it's the act that's like wrong according to the best rules, then we'll agree, yeah, it's wrong sub rules. That's just, I don't think that's relevant to what reasons for action we have.
I mean, I agree that utilitarians can accommodate some intuitions, but I don't think they can accommodate the main intuition about this case, which is that it's wrong, wrong to kill the 1 to save the 5. So, I
just wonder if I even have the same conception of wrongness as you do when you make these claims. I mean, especially when you went on to say, like, another motivation for rule utilitarianism is the thought that, like, it might be that you should just think that the right act is the one that's prescribed by the best rules or something like that. Yeah. That just seems like that's not remotely even in the ballpark of having anything to do with what reasons for action I have.
The morally obligatory thing is the thing that's required by the correct morality.
Well, by morality, are you meaning like the actual correct moral principles, or do you mean like a social code that people internalize? Because those are completely different things.
Well, I mean, but like I meant the correct, I mean, the second stage of this thinking was the correct morality. So a morality is a possible code that could be, the code for a society. Could be
Yeah,
like the
that's not
set
like
of whatever
conceptualizing
the
morality.
conventions. And then you get to, and what is the right one of those to have? It's one that would have the best consequences if it was accepted by society or something like this. Anyway, like, I don't know, like, this is a view you might have about what morality is.
Yeah, I mean, if you take that view, I think that the issue would be that act utilitarianism isn't trying to be a theory of morality. It's a theory of what reasons for action you have. And the idea is what reasons for action we have might have nothing to do with the correct morality in your sense.
Yeah. Well, okay. I mean,
and again, I think this is actually makes the view much more intuitive because, again, I think, it seems, I have that intuition that like it seems wrong in some sense to like push the one person to kill one to save five or that sort of thing. But when you put it in terms of like what you actually have most reason to do, I mean, obviously not everyone will agree, but I at least don't think it's at all counterintuitive to think you could have most reason to kill one to save the five. Not in a way that it seems like intuitively wrong. There just seems sort of like a real disconnect between our intuitions about what's wrong and our intuition about what we have most reason to do. It seems to me what we have reason to do is the important question. If wrongness comes apart from that, then I don't know what it is, and I don't know why we should care about it.
Yeah, I mean, I would be inclined to reason from the wrongness judgment to the reasons judgment. Like, I'd be inclined to say, well, because it's wrong, like that's a really strong reason to not do it. So before I thought about wrongness, I thought you had most reason to kill the one to save the five, but then realized that would be wrong. So that's a decisive reason not to. Anyway, I think we should try to take more questions from the audience. We should try to take a lot of them.
Okay. I mean, the audience doesn't have that many questions, but so one question is, how are actions and inactions differentiated? Would holding one's breath and being still be an inaction, even if doing anything else would stop torture from occurring?
I think the answer to the second is yes. So I don't have a definition of action and inaction, but I think that being completely still and not even breathing is a paradigm in action, regardless of what else is happening, because it's not doing anything, right? So I don't know. So I don't, if you ask like, well, what's a general account? Like, I don't think that there's a definition of basically any natural language concept. I think basically no one has ever defined any concept in natural language, with the exception of a few concepts in mathematics. And, there might be a handful of other concepts, but we've, defined almost nothing ever. So I'm not going to try to define this one.
And I do think it's a nice question because it sort of puts pressure, I think, on the kind of conception of action and inaction that Mike's working from here. Because you can imagine cases where, like, a boulder is about to, it's potentially going to hit someone. Actually, it's going to it's by default going to be derailed and the person will be safe. But there's a slight possibility just that if you manage to hold your body completely still, really unnaturally still, you'd have to try really hard to remain perfectly still as a statue. And if you succeed in doing that, then that will sort of trigger things so that actually the boulder hits the innocent person and kills them. In that case, remaining deliberately really still seems like you're killing the person. It's relevantly, morally akin to an action.
Well, I mean, if you add that you have to try really hard, then I think that might convert it to an action.
Right.
Whatever, you have to form an intention or something. And, that wasn't,
Yeah, so it does seem like something sort of tied to sort of mental effort or something like that might actually be more morally relevant than just the physical stillness, something along those lines.
Yeah.
Another question is for Michael, on your view, are particular rights primitive or derivative of more fundamental principles, e.g. treating people always as ends in themselves?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I'm a pluralistic deontologist, so I guess, well, wait. I mean, so like I have some sort of intuition about not treating people as a mere means. Like, there are cases in which it seems like, yeah, it's wrong. This is wrong because it's treating the person as a mere means. But I don't try to derive all rights from that. And when I think about whether people have rights, I appeal to intuitions like pretty directly. Like, do you have a right to life? Yes. Why do I think you have a right to life? Well, because I could describe these cases in which you have a choice to kill one person to save 5, and it seems like it's wrong to do that. And then, rights talk is supposed to capture that, and then, so, if you ask about rights to other things, I ask analogous questions. So, do you have a right to property? Well, does it seem like, is it wrong to steal something from one person if that would prevent 5 other people from losing their property? Yeah, I guess that still seems wrong. So I guess there's a right to property. Yeah, like a lot of these things, I think, a lot of the rights derive from self-ownership or something like that, or there's like a right not to be harmfully coerced, right? Like, not to have a person use force against you in a way that harms you. So, you could systematize those, but like my starting point would be the intuitions about cases.
One question that I would have about the professor and the janitor case would be, so let's modify it slightly. So let's suppose that the janitor, instead of being a serial killer and going out and killing 20 people, will track down the 50 people who were saved by the professor and like beat them. So they're all by the conjunction, and so they'll be beaten not to death, so they won't die. And so as a result of the professor, so had the professor been a lawyer instead, they would have saved the lives of 50 extra people. And so if we're deciding which one's worse, all those 50 people are left better off, because all of those 50 people, in the case where the professor had taken the other job and the janitor had not assaulted them, well, they would be dead instead of being assaulted. I'm not sure if I described the case clearly, but it does seem like that would be a Pareto improvement.
But I'm not clear on what we're trying to show with this now.
Well, so it seems like if I'm getting some echo from your end.
I don't know. Maybe my microphone is picking up stuff in the speakers.
Okay. Yeah, it doesn't seem to be gone now, but it's okay. So if anyone in the audience is bothered by it, let me know. Then but if no one is, then so it seems like if we're saying that the action of the professor is worse than the action of the serial killer, then we would say that if we had the choice of changing the minds of one of them, we would rather change the minds of the serial killer than of the professor.
Right.
And so if we make it so that the serial killer, rather than being a serial killer, is a serial tracker down of people who have been benefited by GiveWell and then assaulter, so they beat all the people. Well, it seems like as a result of if the professor took the lawyer job instead, and the person became the serial GiveWell assaulter, everyone would be made better off. All the victims of the professor, all the victims of the janitor, because all of them would, instead of dying from malaria, all of them would be assaulted, which is of course not pleasant, but it's less bad than dying of malaria.
Right. Okay. So I think I get the point now. Okay. So the professor is saving 50 lives every year, and then the serial beater is beating them up, and then you're like, and I assume if the professor doesn't do it, then this guy will beat up a different group of people, so there will still be the same number of beatings, I guess. But you're like, you can change one of their minds. You could change the mind of the professor, and then they won't. Oh wait, sorry.
Well, no, it's just to be clear, the scenario is that the serial beater is will beat up the 50 will beat up 50 people unless his mind is changed. And so you can either change his mind, or you can change the mind of the professor, making him a making him decide to become a lawyer, saving the 50 people.
Okay. But then those 50 are the ones who are going to get beat up here. So you're like, try to change the professor's mind and make him become the wealthy lawyer. Is that better? I guess you should do that. But then therefore what? So you should try to, I guess, it'd be better to try to convince the professor to save 50 lives every year rather than to try to convince the beater to stop beating 50 people if somehow that you had that choice. But I don't think that it follows that it's actually obligatory for the professor to do that. Right.
Just as the more important action, I think, is the implication. And that's really all that utilitarianism claims too. It's not, I don't think there's any inference from this to the fact that the professor is a worse person when he fails to do it. I think you can comfortably combine utilitarianism with a quality of will account of blameworthiness and say, the beater or the serial killer or whatever is a worse person. They've got positively malicious quality of will. The professor's just kind of not quite as benevolent as would be ideal, but at least he's not actively thinking, wanting to impose bad things on people. So we can explain that intuition.
I mean, so the utilitarians would say, so maybe the serial killer is more vicious than the professor, more whatever, morally blameworthy and such. But I want to focus on, but is he acting worse? Most people would say no, he's not acting really in that, who had the stronger reasons to behave differently? So there's a guy who's murdering 30 people every year. Does he have a stronger reason to stop doing that than the professor has to change his career? It seems like he does, right? If you want to phrase it in terms of reasons.
Wouldn't it be odd then when you add in Matthew's case that we have a disconnect then between the strength of reasons for action and the strength of reasons for other people to prevent an action?
There's the reason, the reasons for these two agents, and then there's the reasons for a third party to try to do something intervening. So the third party might have. The third party's reasons don't necessarily track the strength of the other people's reasons. But also, Matthew kind of changed it from a serial killer to somebody who only beats someone, which weakens that person's reasons to have not done that.
Well, we can make it so that the person gives them a poison vial that kills to all 50 people, that kills 60% of them. That makes it so that some of the people are not in fact made better off. But so, I think actually maybe the best case would be they give all the people we can just leave it at that. And it seems like it's better for 20 people and worse for no one. But you brought up that there's a difference between what a third party should influence people to do and what the people should do. Well, so there would be kind of 2 points I'd make about that. The first one would be that you were asking, from the standpoint of a third party, which one would we judge to be morally worse? And the second one is that we can just modify the case to make it so that the professor is making a decision about which of those people to be. So the person is currently a professor, and they're deciding about whether to take the two actions conjunctively of becoming a lawyer, saving 50 extra people, but then poisoning the 50 people, killing 60% of them or something. And so it still seems like it's a Pareto improvement. Everyone's, no one's worse off and 20 people are better off.
Okay, so I guess, the question is, should he do both of those things or do neither of those if somehow those are his options? I'm not sure about that. I mean, like, I'm inclined to think, like, why can't he become a lawyer and then not give the poison? Like, somehow he doesn't have any choice. He's forced to give the poison.
Well, let's just stipulate this person. We all fall prey to acrasia sometimes. So this person will. But he just knows that it's a fact about his personality that that if he becomes a lawyer, he'll, as most of us do, he'll track down all the GiveWell recipients benefited and poison them all with a poison with a 60% mortality rate.
And I think they do teach that in law school.
Yeah.
The importance of poisoning people.
Yeah. And so he's deciding whether, in virtue of that, he should still become a lawyer or become a janitor.
Yeah. So, it seems like that's just, so you could say that's just equivalent to deciding whether or not to save 20 people. That's like, yeah, it would be good to do that. So it would be better to do that, I guess.
Well, but if you're already accommodating the intuition that if the person is deciding whether to become the janitor or the serial killing lawyer, that they should become the serial killing lawyer, then it, like that, if you're accommodating that, then that does sort of, and you're accommodating that that they should, rather that from their own perspective, acting morally, they should be the lawyer rather than the janitor, and from the standpoint of a third party, they should prefer the janitor to the lawyer, the lawyer action to the janitor action. It sort of starts to seem to undermine the intuition pretty considerably.
Yeah, the reasons to save must have outweighed the reasons not to kill.
Right. I mean, again, you guys assume that, the reasons have a certain weight irrespective of the context or something, like the same weight for all agents and in all circumstances or something like this. Yeah. And it makes a difference that the 30 people who are going to be killed are ones who are going to die anyway. If the poison goes to different people so that you save 50 and then there's 30 different people who die, then no, you can't do it.
Well, okay, but so then we can modify the case again. This is getting increasingly contrived. But so the person is deciding between working at two law firms. The law firms are otherwise identical. But they know at one law firm, they would have the disposition to kill the 30 people who they would have otherwise saved. And at the other law firm, they would have a disposition to kill only 20 people who they would not have otherwise saved. It seems like killing the 20 people would be better than killing the 30 people.
Okay, I'm getting confused about this now. Sort of getting confused about the scenario.
So the scenario is, so the person is deciding between three career paths. Career path one is they become a janitor. That's certainly the least interesting of the three options, the least eventful. Option two is they become a lawyer.
Wait, sorry, this is a serial killing janitor or just a regular one?
Just a regular janitor.
Yeah.
Option two is they become a lawyer at law firm one. As a result of being a lawyer at law firm one, they'll earn an extra $100,000, or an extra however many dollars. They'll be able to save the lives of 50 people by donating it to GiveWell, and they'll do so. However, they'll also poison all 50 people, killing 30 of them. So they're deciding between that and the janitor one. And it seems like that's an improvement over the janitor one because it's better for some and worse for none. And then they're deciding between, and then their third job option is they'll also become a lawyer, but they'll work at a different law firm. They work at this law firm, they'll donate the same amount of money to GiveWell, but then they'll give the poison vial to enough people to kill 20 random other people who are not saved as a result of GiveWell. Like it seems like to kill 20 people who are not
right. So there'll be a net savings of 30 lives. Okay. Yeah.
Right. So that would be a net savings of 10 lives over the option where they save the people over GiveWell. So if we accept transitivity, which of course we all do. Well, I don't know if Richard does, but you do. Then that would mean that the option of killing the 20 people and donating enough to save the lives of 50 people would be better than just being a janitor and not having extra money to donate.
Yeah, no, I think he should do the second option where he donates and then gives the poison to the same people he donated to. I mean, like, I think part of what is what is striking you as paradoxical is that, well, what you have reason to do is not completely determined by the correct axiological judgment. So, like, it's a better state of affairs where you save 30 lives rather than only 20. But, it's less wrong.
I've got to go in a couple of minutes, but maybe just to sort of wrap up some of the conversation. And I think the discussion of the role of intuitions here has been really important, I think. And so I think it's striking that Mike has really pushed the idea that, he's all about intuitions and they're the important thing, and that utilitarianism is wrong because it can't accommodate our intuitions. I'm sort of really wanting to flip it around and say, I mean, I agree that intuitions are important, but I focus on different ones from the intuitions that Mike focuses on. It's because I think these case-based intuitions are kind of superficial. I think we can accommodate them in different ways by talking about things like negative character and those sorts of things rather than wrongness per se. Or even if we do talk about some form of wrongness, it's maybe not the thing that actually is morally important. Maybe what's more important is just reasons for action and some sort of independent thing that we can directly evaluate rather than indirectly by means of intuitions about wrongness. So I'm focused on slightly different intuitions. But then I think what's really important to me is our sort of deeper intuitions about what's really important, what makes sense in terms of like coherent principles that fit together nicely, intuitions about sort of the role of preferences and how to make preferences coherent with what you want to do. So I think there are a lot of areas where we've seen that deontology is actually quite counterintuitive. There are, these apparent paradoxes, these difficulties for deontology. So I don't think it's at all clear cut that actually utilitarianism is the more counterintuitive view on net. My argument would just be it's counterintuitive in different ways. I think less important ways, and it's actually more intuitive on the really important stuff, the sort of deeper principles and the ideas about what's really important. So that's sort of my pitch in a nutshell.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I appreciate this point of view. I don't think you're completely crazy, but I think... I have a more general background, I guess, epistemological view that I think people put too much trust in sort of abstract generalizations, and philosophers are just constantly going wrong about those things, and it's easier to judge a concrete case. And then I think utilitarianism conflicts with a lot of really strong and really widespread intuitions about particular cases, and that should just make you think, I've just somehow not understood something about this, abstract general principle, or you're trying to reason from premises about quote what really matters, and then I think you should just go, maybe I'm confused about what matters, maybe I'm confused about this whole idea or whatever. Because it's not corresponding to our judgments about particular cases.
Well, thanks for the conversation. It's enjoyable.
Yep. Okay, thanks. And thank you, Matthew, for organizing.
Yeah, no problem. Michael, if you still have time, I'd be happy to keep chatting about some of these. But
it's been a couple hours, so I should probably get going and get to work.
Okay. All right. Just final note before people go. One thing that one of my friends asked was, Matthew, why are you discussing random philosophers assassinating each other over lottery tickets? Which I thought was sort of an amusing question.
Why not? How could you not want to hear about that? Okay.
Yeah, all right.
All right.
Thanks for watching. Bye.